This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/broedeschanel. Also, I have a podcast, and it's called Rehash. I'm hosting it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about the social media phenomenons that strike a nerve in our culture, only to be quickly forgotten, but we think are due for a revisiting. We've just finished our second season, which explores internet archetypes and the many lives they've lived. We're looking at everything from pick-me's to gaslighters to himbos. You can find it now wherever you get your podcasts. Go check it out. The Sixth Sense, Notting Hill, American Beauty, Being John Malkovich, The Matrix, The Virgin Suicides, Fight Club, Eyes Wide Shut, American Pie, Rushmore, The Talented Mr. Ripley, Office Space, The Best Man, Boys Don't Cry, Magnolia, The Blair Witch Project, Girl Interrupted. Chances are you've seen half, if not most, of the films I just listed. Chances are you've found yourself debating a few of them at some point in your life. And chances are at least one of them had a major impact on you in one way or another. And if I were to tell you that all of these films came out in 1999, would you believe me? It's true. 1999 was a stacked year for American filmmaking, colored by some of the most bizarre, innovative, thematically provocative, and most importantly, memorable films to date. Of course, there have been other years that are jam-packed with legendary films. 1939, 1967, and 1977 are great ones. The most recent which comes to mind for me is 2017, which gave us paradigm-shifting movies like Get Out, Call Me By Your Name, Lady Bird, Dunkirk, and Phantom Thread, all of which made it to the Oscars. But there's something about 1999 that had a particular impact, where films of all genres managed to stay on our favorites lists for decades, or became so popular that they've experienced second and third lives as overrated and then rated again. Why was 1999 such an iconic year for movies? We can't fully understand what was happening in 1999 without jumping back 10 years to the release of Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape. The rise of home video and video rentals in the 80s allowed a number of independent distributors to pop up, but by the end of the decade, many of these, like Vestron, Island, and Cinecom, ended up investing more into bigger budget productions. So people were expecting the independent market to collapse. That was until Miramax came around. I'm sure most of you know by now that Miramax was founded by convicted sex offender Harvey Weinstein and his brother Bob. But unfortunately, I can't overstate how much of an influence this company had over 90s cinema. Miramax, who had had quite a few hits in the 80s but were still relatively small, took a risk on Soderbergh's weird, sleepy, moody film, and it more than paid off. Through some incredibly savvy marketing, by using terms like independent and quality, they positioned Sex, Lies, and Videotape as a David to the studio's cookie-cutter, schlocky Goliaths. This type of edgy filmmaking was very alluring for big-name actors who wanted to delve into more sophisticated and challenging subject matter. And even better, it generated a very wide, very curious audience. As Alisa Perren explains for Film Quarterly, the company played up Sex, Lies, and Videotape to the press in ways that helped the film move out of the so-called art house ghetto. In the process of marketing Sex, Lies, and Videotape as a quality independent as opposed to an art house entity, Miramax also played itself up to the press in ways that helped to construct the company as the primary force in the film's development and financial success. She sees the film as integral to a renaissance of new Hollywood aesthetics, economics, and structure for the new age. Sex, Lies, and Videotape went on to earn over $24 million at the North American box office with a $1.1 million budget, which on a cost-to-earning ratio was a better investment than Batman. The film premiered at Sundance and its reception was explosive, so much so that it even had Soderbergh a bit worried. I'm a little concerned by what Sex, Lies might have wrought here. This can become more of a film market than a film festival. And I mean, his fears would later be realized. Film festivals have definitely become a marketplace for distributors to place their bids right then and there, sometimes even before the film runs. But this also meant independent films could get their commercial breaks. With the added bonus of digital editing software, camera innovations, and a new generation of directors, writers, and film executives who had grown up on new Hollywood films of the 60s and 70s and were now coming out of film school, as well as even older established directors who were coming out with daring films of their own, we were going to see a major boom here. And it would get a name. Indie would. In Best Movie Year Ever, How 1999 Blew Up the Big Screen, Brian Raftery writes 20 years later, in 2019, about how the 90s led to exactly that, the best movie year ever. He attributes the exceptionality of 1999 to this convergence of indie film and Hollywood box office numbers, saying, "By the time Sundance 1999 rolled around, there was a well-worn playbook for turning a low-budget movie into a middle-brow success, one that Miramax had helped create. Find a slightly outsidery tale of uplift with a famous face or two, hype up its festival cred and underdog charm, roll it out delicately across the country." So we had this decade where experimental cult films were being produced en masse, and for the most part actually being seen by the public. Films that had escaped the art house theaters where they would have traditionally belonged. The indie distributors can't take all the credit though. After all, how were they jailbreaking their films out of the art house? One word. Well, actually 2.5. AMC Grand 24. A couple years ago, the design and architecture podcast 99% Invisible released an episode about the invention of the movie Megaplex. You know, those semi-monstrosities you drive by on the way to your local suburban box mall. The podcast marks 1995 as a game-changing year for the world of movie exhibition. The year that the first Megaplex, the AMC Grand 24, in Dallas was built. Essentially, movie theaters had their heyday all the way back in the 40s, before television, home video, DVD, and streaming services came to ruin things for everyone. By the time the 50s rolled around and television got its start, theaters were forced to make moviegoing a whole event, screening only the most spectacular, big-budget films they could get their hands on. This was also a time where a film only lived at a single given location, typically in urban areas, so you had to trek there pilgrimage style if you wanted to see it. But as the suburbs expanded, studios realized there was enough demand to build theaters out there, resulting in the construction of some pretty strange cinemas in the early 70s. These ones cut up their screens to allow for more films to be shown simultaneously, resulting in super long and narrow, cramped cinemas. A lot of these were built in malls around this time too. Now, initially, the movie-going experience was a bit of a luxury one where you and the kids would get all dolled up for a sophisticated night on the town. But these mall cinemas were pretty gross and not properly cared for, leading to a drop in ticket sales in the mid-80s when people were opting to watch films from the comfort of their own homes. Again, we were seeing the 50s trend of fewer, spectacular movies take hold, as theaters tried to accommodate for declining numbers. This is right around when Stan Durwood created the American Multi-Cinema, or AMC, a new style of cinema with neon lights, clean seats, arcade games, stadium seating, and most importantly, many, many more screens. This changed everything. Now, with the proliferation of screens to show movies on, studios had to start producing more movies, giving them more room to experiment with a greater variety of films. Now, more original, smaller-scale films were getting their own real estate. As they say on 99% Invisible, the Megaplex was a Trojan horse for slipping strange movies into unsuspecting suburbs. If the latest teen movie is sold out, kids might end up seeing something like John Malkovich. And yeah, being John Malkovich is really, really weird.
Malkovich.
But it's also one of the most revered films of 1999 and opened in 630 theaters. More eyes on these offbeat movies meant more people were seeing stuff that reflected their daily realities, that encouraged them to ponder the human condition, rather than the escapist fluff that had typically dominated the screen. In a way, this was perfect timing for the late 90s imaginary. 1999 was a peculiar year for the culture. For starters, this was a year marred by Y2K hysteria, when people were freaking out about a software issue that would lead to computers processing the year 2000 as 1900, which could potentially shut them down entirely. Since society was increasingly digitized at this point, these computers were in charge of a ton of critical systems that ran everyday life: communications, electricity, transportation, finance, medicine, employment, and the government. Some predicted that this would lead to a global shutdown and ensuing Armageddon. None of this ended up happening, and many of the foreseen problems ended up being solved before midnight January 1st, 2000. My dad was actually a part of a team working with the Canadian Ministry of Health to mitigate disruptions to the system, fun fact. But this doesn't mean that the fear leading up to it didn't pervade the collective psyche at the time. As Raftery surmises, whether they were freaked out by technology or theology, many of the end-timers shared a common tut-tutting anxiety, namely that we'd advanced a bit too much during the 20th century, sacrificing our humanity in favor of ease and desire. Two major groups were both the purveyors and inheritors of the Y2K Panic, groups who were also the target audience for these types of movies I'm talking about. One was the baby boomers, who occupied a cohort of people in their 30s and 40s. People who once belonged to the hippie generation but had now evolved into active participants of the managerial and professional middle class. In their 1978 book, Between Labor and Capital, Barbara and John Ehrenreich call these newly middle-aged boomers the professional managerial class, which consists of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. In other words, office folk. These guys were considered a new middle class, and so determined new tastes, patterns of consumption, and an entirely new class consciousness. The other group were the cohort of people ranging from their late teens to mid-30s, who were expected to helm whatever future was brought about by this impending catastrophe. Generation X, a term coined by Douglas Copeland in a 1991 essay for Vancouver magazine, which he used to define his generation's lack of definability. Generation X came into the world at a time of shifting social values, experiencing childhood during an uptick in divorce rates, and when women were entering the workforce en masse. They were called latchkey kids, children who were left all alone to fend for themselves. They had grown up with the disillusionment brought about by Watergate, economic fears of the oil crisis, and served witness to the 24-hour media frenzies of the OJ trial and the Lewinsky scandal. Also, they had seen technology become a governing and radicalizing force with the dot-com boom. For them, the boomers were sellouts, traitors to the tenets of hippiedom. But to the boomers, Gen X were useless and aimless.
Try something for once in your life, do something about it, but you know what? You better do it now, and you better do it fast, because the world doesn't owe you any favors.
Which triggered a general resentment from younger generations. As writer Jeff Gordiner laments, I don't really understand the tyranny of the boomer movement. Great, you had a party in Haight-Ashbury in 1967. I'm thrilled for you. When Edward Norton was interviewed by Raftery about Fight Club, he echoed a pretty similar sentiment, expressing an annoyance with the re-release of the Volkswagen Beetle, which was actually my family car growing up. Another fun fact. They just want to repackage an authentic baby boomer youth experience to us. They don't even want us to have our own. They just want us to buy sentiment for the 60s, and they wonder why we're cynical. You know that Camus book, The Myth of Sisyphus? The one where he uses that Greek myth about a man named Sisyphus who's condemned to push a boulder up a hill and watch it roll back down for the rest of eternity, to ruminate about the absurdity of the human condition. Camus says, "Man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." For Camus, in the face of absurdity, one has two choices: self-imposed death or acceptance. To go on living, quote, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I think this is the guiding theme for 1999 as a movie year. A lot of these films explore feelings of nihilism, impotence, and listlessness. Many of their protagonists are chained to drab offices, a monotonous, senseless middle-class life. And they're often left with a choice. They can either stay in the fog and die, or look beyond it and choose a sort of absurd, twisted happiness. I think what makes these films so special is that they really crack at the foundations of American identity, particularly the tenuous facade of the American dream. Many of these films investigate a sense of broken masculinity that was permeating the US at the time.
Is that what a man looks like?
As Garin Pernia writes for Esquire, Fight Club, American Beauty, and Office Space depicted the American male eschewing societal norms and sometimes literally fisticuffing against consumerism, suburbia, and complacency. Even films like Boys Don't Cry and Virgin Suicides, both of which had women directors, posit similar ideas. Boys Don't Cry highlights the violence that erupts from challenged masculinity. The Virgin Suicides watches the Lisbon sisters through the lens of neighborhood boys who, when the film visits them years later, live in the distorted memories of their adolescence to cope with the mundanity of their middle-aged suburban lives. But I think American Beauty is the perfect encapsulation of where the culture was at this year. A provocative, mid-budget film directed by then-unknown Sam Mendes, American Beauty tells the story of a man, Lester Burnham, feeling stifled by his routine middle-class life and fantasizing about his daughter's underage friend. And yes, he is quite unfortunately played by Kevin Spacey. He also has a sour Gen X daughter who hates her boomer parents and becomes infatuated with her disaffected and alienated neighbor. The film begins with Lester telling us that in a year, he will be dead, and it suggests that his daughter and her lover may have been the ones to do it. American Beauty swept at the Oscars, raking in 5 awards, including Best Picture. It also absolutely exploded at the box office, and received universal praise upon its release. Harvey Weinstein considered it to be a descendant of Sex, Lies, and Videotape, with its taboo subject matter and unexpected commercial success. And while the film has slowly undergone a re-examination as overrated and pretentious, Raftery pinpoints why people took it so well in 1999. It tapped into a feeling that had been building throughout 1999, that something about the country was slightly off, in a year that saw a pair of suburban Colorado teenage killers dubbed the Monsters Next Door on the cover of Time, and a president who almost lost his job over a May-December sex scandal. The seamy underbelly of American Beauty felt creepily relatable. This was also the year that Columbine happened. For me, the film also gets to the heart of the boomer Gen X culture war, and the effects of an increasingly mediatized society. Lester is an everyman, an advertising shill, and emasculated suburban husband. Like the narrator in Fight Club, he is confronted with temptation which seduces him away from the monotony of his life and into some sort of real experience. In Fight Club, it's violence. Here, it's Angela Hayes, a Gen X teenager who feels pressured to play into the nymphette persona that this predatory society has laid out for her. The film's stance on the nymphette is an interesting one, but that's for another video. Lester is also at odds with his daughter, who is listless, unambitious, and disgusted by her parents' blind adherence to suburban custom and materialism. Like Neo with the Red Pill, the narrator with Project Mayhem, and Craig with the Malkovich portal, Lester must decide whether to accept the conditions of his senseless life or reject them. In many instances, these protagonists choose to reject or destroy them, but Lester chooses acceptance. Of course, the way the film allows him to realize this is one big ethical question mark, but ultimately, Lester chooses to imagine Sisyphus happy. And yet, immediately after he does so, he dies. It's ambiguous as to whether this ending is meant to be liberating or depressing. Lester has fallen to temptation, but we see him redeemed at the end of the film. Whether this redemption is earned is, again, dubious. The fact that he cannot go on living after he's seen the light or broken from the confines of his doomed sellout generation really illuminates the reifying power of this American way of being. And it seems that this concept of nihilistic despair was incredibly evocative for 1999 audiences. After all, the world was about to end, right? Target audiences, the baby boomers and Generation X, were impotent and about to enter the great nothing. And right at the end of eternity, wasn't it better to just accept it? While 1999 is widely considered one of the best years for filmmaking, it is also considered a peak with a very, very steep drop-off. The proliferation of the Megaplex made it so that no one wanted to go back to the dingy old theaters, which led to a burst in the theater bubble. Theaters began closing down, and with fewer screens meant, again, fewer movies. Attention was placed back onto the opening weekend, and Blockbuster started dominating the screen again. This is something, as you know, we're still grappling with today. Producers couldn't get their movies greenlit unless there was a guarantee it would make big numbers, so the bets got safer. Raftery also suspects that 9/11 played a role in shaping public consciousness. People didn't want to see gritty doses of reality anymore. As Steven Soderbergh tells him, "I think 9/11, in a very subconscious way, changed the reasons people go to the movies. It's an event the country still hasn't processed or healed from, and without anyone saying it out loud, this sense of, well, you go to the movies to escape, but after 9/11, that feeling really took hold." Miramax was also kind of turning its attention away from weirdo indies to bigger budget productions. The company was purchased by Disney in 1993, which made it bloat into an industry powerhouse not unlike the Hollywood majors it had originally positioned itself against. It started investing in audience pleasers like Scary Movie, Scream, and Chocolat, prioritizing movies that would guarantee big bucks. The fervor of 1999 had come to a close, and while there have been many wonderful movies made in the new millennium, it's becoming increasingly difficult to recreate that indie spirit. As Raftery concludes, the film industry has long been prone to seismic ruptures, whether it was the arrival of the talkies or the decline of once reliable westerns and musicals. Yet it's always managed to evolve, push into the future by daring execs, risk-rewarding audiences, and the occasional filmmaking raging bull or two. Yet many of the changes Hollywood has seen in the early 21st century, from studio mega-mergers to run-amok budgets to big brand mania, feel downright epical, perhaps even insurmountable. Perhaps he's right. But here's the thing though, and this is something Raftery talks about. There were some weirdo indies from 1999 that got the sex, lies, and videotape treatment, and made a ton of money despite their modest budgets. But a lot of memorable films from that year also didn't. Eyes Wide Shut, its director and star considered, was deemed a critical and financial flop. Rushmore, The Virgin Suicides, and Election all performed quite poorly, yet that's not how we think of them today. They're classics. I think what it really goes to show is that we need to keep taking risks on weird films, and to keep in mind that while the industry may be imploding right now, and while so many incredible films from last year barely broke even at the box office, this doesn't mean that they won't be cherished down the line, or that they aren't perfect springboards for innovative talents. Like I said, films from 2017 have already ascended to legendary heights. So instead of using 1999 to lament about the state of things right now, we should use it to keep the hope alive. For now, let's just look at this wonderful moment and think, wow, that was a damn good year. If you're looking to keep the indie spirit alive, Mubi is a great place to go. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. It's for lovers of great cinema and those who don't know they love great cinema yet, because the beauty of Mubi is that it exposes you to artful, thought-provoking, and innovative films you would never think to watch. A filmmaker who I think is really pushing the boundaries of her medium is Rebecca Hunt, whose debut film BIBA is a breathtaking self-portrait of her life as an Afro-Latina woman coming of age in New York. BIBA plays with form and structure to give us an intimate glimpse into Hunt's perspective on family, class, and identity as she hurtles into adulthood. Her story is told as a memoir through candid and poetic narration and doesn't shy away from the difficult truth of surviving in America. BIBA is absolutely gorgeous and a very fresh take on the documentary genre. You can find it right now on Mubi as part of their documentary series. Discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/broedeschanel. That's mubi.com/broedeschanel for a whole month of great cinema for free. Special thank you to Louis Osta, Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, D.H. Klein, Daniel Sardunas, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, Siddhant Iyer Sekira, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.